Welcome back to Faithfully Feminist, the show where we meet women and women-adjacent questions at the intersection of Catholicism, history, vocation, and most of all, hope. Today's conversation is a little bit different. We're not spotlighting a saint, a mystic, or a historical figure. Instead, we're taking on an idea, one that sits just beneath the surface of almost every conversation about women in the church. The utopian feminine mystique. And right beside it, the question of women's leadership and priesthood in Reformed or reforming Catholicism. And this episode is asking, what vision of womanhood does the church hold out? Where does that vision become beautiful, life-giving, and liberating? And where does it become a kind of utopia? An impossible, idealized feminine identity detached from actual women's lives? And then, inevitably, what happens when that utopian vision collides with real questions about authority, ministry, sacrament, and the role women play in shaping the church? And to explore that, we'll draw deeply on an important essay, Reform Catholicism, the Christianity You Should Want. It gives us a framework for thinking about how the church develops, how it resists development, and why questions like women's ordination become touch points for much larger tensions. Okay, so let's begin with the phrase itself, the utopian feminine mystique. In secular culture, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique critiqued an ideal of domestic womanhood that promised fulfillment but delivered, well, entrapment. A mystique precisely because women were defined by myth rather than reality. In the church, a different mystique has often emerged, one that idealizes women as naturally holy, naturally pure, naturally maternal, naturally receptive, naturally self-sacrificing, and most of all, naturally obedient. And these traits are beautiful in and of themselves, but they become problematic when the church teaches them as essential, archetypal, or exclusive to women. And the result is that women are treated not as persons first, but as symbols. Women become icons of purity rather than subjects of vocation. They become spiritual metaphors rather than actual agents in the church. This is the utopian feminine mystique. A woman who is entirely self-giving but never self-expressing. A woman who nurtures but never governs. A woman who sacrifices but never decides. A woman who receives but is never authorized. And a woman whose sanctity is praised more than her leadership is trusted. The mystique is utopian because it's impossible, unreal, and ultimately unhelpful for real women navigating real faith. And ironically, it often prevents us from seeing the actual women of Scripture, history, and today, who lead, preach, teach, organize, criticize, build institutions, and push the church forward. So, this is where the Reform Catholicism essay becomes so helpful. The authors, with the link in the bio, argue that Vatican II opened the door to a Catholicism that was more humanist, historically conscientious, biblically grounded, attentive to the dignity of each person, and most of all, more willing to integrate modern knowledge, psychology, social science, politics, feminism, into its self-understanding. But they argue the church never really completed that reform. Women's participation increased in practice, but not in governance, sacramental ministry, or formal authority. Why, though? Because the church continued to operate with a kind of inherited utopian imaginary, an idealized vision of masculine priesthood and feminine submission that Vatican II never fully dismantled. The essay puts it bluntly as such. A church unwilling to share power with women in a serious way proved morally incredible to generations of women. And that line is crucial. Because the church can praise women, it can canonize them, celebrate them, quote them, educate them, and still fail to trust them with actual ecclesiastical authority. This is the heart of the tension. The Catholic Church has a rich theology of women, but a thin practice of empowering them. So, let's name a few places where this mystique becomes especially visible. First of all is the Marian archetype. Mary, Mother of God, is often framed not as a Jewish girl in Roman-occupied Palestine who said yes to a terrifying vocation, but as a cosmic ideal of perfect womanhood, whose very perfection becomes unattainable. She is frequently held up as a symbol of passivity, rather than the woman who prophesied political upheaval in the Magnificat. Second of all, is the spiritual motherhood narrative. Spiritual maternity is real and meaningful, but it becomes distorted when it's used to limit women to nurturing roles, denies them sacramental leadership, and romanticizes self-sacrifice to the point of erasing identity. Thirdly, is the theology of the body's gender essentialism. St. John Paul II's theology of the body gave language to the beauty of embodiment. It is wonderful in that way, but it also reinforced strict gender complementarity, which shapes how the church imagines leadership. Women nurture, men govern. Women receive, men give. Women symbolize the church, and men symbolize Christ. And if these symbols harden into assumptions about sacramental power, women become excluded by design. So, the Reform Catholicism essay does not hide its position. It argues that priestly celibacy is unnecessary, women's ordination is compatible with scripture and tradition, and the diaconate for women is historically grounded in theologically justified. It also points out a historical fact, strikingly, that the Pontifical Biblical Commission found no scriptural warrant against women's ordination. That is, Scripture does not forbid it. The prohibition is historical, cultural, and institutional, not divine. Reform Catholicism says the Church can change because it has always changed. The authors invoke Newman. An idea develops. Tradition instead unfolds. The Church grows into deeper understanding. If we allow doctrine to develop as it always has, then women's ordination cannot be dismissed out of hand. It must be discerned with intellectual seriousness and pastoral honesty. And that is what terrifies many Catholics. Because loosening the mystical ideal of womanhood means rethinking governance, power, ministry, symbolism, and the shape of the priesthood itself. It feels like pulling a thread that might unravel the whole tapestry. But Reformed Catholicism insists that fear is the fear of losing an older form of the faith, not the fear of losing the faith itself. So, here's where we land the plane. The Catholic response to the utopian feminine mystique is not to reject feminine symbolism, not to flatten gender differences, not to simply import secular feminism wholesale into ecclesiology. The response is far more subtle, more demanding, and most of all, more Catholic. Recover the humanity of women before their symbolism. Let women be persons, thinking, gifted, called, discerning, fallible, and grace-filled, before we are cast as metaphors. Stop using femininity as a theological container, and listen to women as agents of God's self-revelation. Recognize that vocation is not defined by biology, but by baptism. See the Church not as this fragile system that must be protected from women's gifts, but as a living body that is incomplete without them. And finally, embrace Vatican II's unfinished revolution. That is, of a church more synodal, more participatory, more historically conscious, and more willing to let the laity, especially women, shape its future. This is not utopia. It's discipleship, responsibility, and it's what the Reform Catholicism essay calls a Christianity of the penitent and the pilgrim. Where we admit we have not always gotten women right, we have not always listened well, and we have not trusted women with authority or formation or sacrament, but we can grow, and in fact we must grow, because the Christianity we should want, the Christianity that can survive the 20th century and the 21st century, is one where women are not symbols of holiness, but subjects of vocation, where the feminine mystique is replaced with the feminine real, the flesh and blood holiness of women who teach, lead, govern, create, interpret, counsel, and carry the gospel into the world. And that is not utopia. That is simply the Church becoming more fully what she already claims to be. This conversation stirred something in you. Hope, frustration, curiosity. Stay with it. This season is all about vocation, agency, and the future of Catholic womanhood. And next time, we'll return to a figure whose story embodies exactly that tension. Until then, I'm Raleigh, and this is Faithfully Feminist.